Thank you. For the record, both assistant state attorneys are present, all for defense counsel and Mr. Rodgers. Is there any additional instructions either side would like?
Yes, sir, Your Honor. I provided a copy to the state.
Okay.
And we would request the instruction on circumstantial evidence. As Your Honor noted at the time of JOA, this is certainly a circumstantial case. It's a standard instruction and discretionary on the part of the judge.
State.
Judge, I think the court noted at JOA that with the exception of the direct testimony of fellow Shoemaker and direct testimony of Mr. Wright, that the evidence was circumstantial, which means this is not a circumstantial case.
Components.
Yes, there are circumstantial components to the case. However, this instruction creates what we believe is an unnecessary and burdensome legal standard that doesn't exist. If the court's going to give an instruction on circumstantial evidence, and the court should also give an instruction on direct evidence.
Let me see the instruction.
I'll give the court my copy. I have an electronic copy.
I'm trying to open it up electronically, but if it's standard.
It was the standard, and then because it's now discretionary, it's not included in the standard, but it was the standard instruction. Or a standard instruction.
It is not now a standard instruction.
That's why we're asking for it.
All right, I'll think about it. Anything else? State?
Nothing further from the state.
Defense? And you mentioned at sidebar an issue about sequestration. Are you, that is normally done at the penalty phase. Is that what you're talking about, or?
No, sir, any deliberations, I'm gonna rely on Campbell v. State.
Well, I'm just asking, most people waive that for this portion of it, and usually sequester them during the penalty phase, and we did not breach that with the jury at all, and I guess I'm gonna have to, and jury selection. So I'm asking if you're waiving that, or are you asking for sequestration at this, after they begin to deliberate?
Once they start to deliberate, yes, I mean, this has been a death penalty case from the start. The state filed notice. That's a rule, and it to my knowledge, it is always used in the first phase as well as the second phase. What the law says is you can take a break between first and second phases. So yes, we are not waiving it, no.
I'm just asking because generally, I know if you ask for it, I have to do it, and but generally, the last few that have been here in Lee County that I recall, I'm pretty sure they were waived. But if you're not waiving it, I just need to know that, and I want you to put it on the record. You want sequestration at this point, then, for this portion of the trial, if that's what you want, because I'm going to have to instruct the jury on it, and that's going to change my game plan here today as well.
We're not waiving it, sir.
Okay. Then what I suggest is we do closing statements. I'm going to send them home, and then I will instruct them tomorrow morning, and they can then begin deliberations after my instructions tomorrow morning.
Will they be told ahead of time there's a possibility?
Oh, I'm not going to tell them it's a possibility. You're not waiving. I'm going to tell them that it's going to happen if they don't have a verdict by the end of the day tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
State, anything else?
From the state, Your Honor.
Okay, you ready?
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense is ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay, bring them out. Please be seated. I'll ask our jurors again, did you follow my instructions, not talk about the case among yourselves or with anybody else, or look up any of the people or places involved? Even if you did so inadvertently, now would be the time to raise your hand and let me know. For the record, no jurors lifted their hand. Both the state and the defendant have now rested their case. The attorneys now will present their final arguments. Please remember that what the attorneys say is not evidence or your instruction on the law. However, do listen closely to their arguments. They are intended to aid you in understanding the case. Each side will have equal time, but the state is entitled to divide this time between an opening argument and a rebuttal argument after the defendant has spoken. State.
Why? Why? As we start the end, closing, let's start with Teresa Sievers' last word. Why? As Teresa Sievers lay cold on her kitchen floor, Mark Sievers called not his mother, who had been watching the animals that weekend, but Mark Botrytis, an acquaintance, to have him come to the house and check. Dr. Botrytis finds Teresa Sievers, and emergency personnel are called. And as we heard from Adam Hughes, when they arrive and they enter the house, they don't go beyond the door into the kitchen because they see Teresa Sievers and they know she is deceased. Shortly thereafter, law enforcement arrives and they will begin a lengthy processing of the home of Teresa Sievers, a home that is now the scene of a horrible crime. Evidence was collected. Hundreds of photos were taken, some of which are for you here in the court. Every room was processed, including the garage. The outside of the home was examined. Swabs for DNA were collected, both from evidence and from people. Surfaces were dusted for prints. Bins of papers were collected. A hammer with hair was taken into evidence. The victim's cell phone was collected. Receipts were gathered from the floor. Law enforcement went on a search for video from anywhere. And as we heard from Captain Long, the apartments behind Jarvis Street did not have video. But still, law enforcement sought videos from anywhere and any business they could in the area. It was all hands on deck, but nothing was found. As we heard from Kim Van Was, the hammer with the blood, the only DNA results were the victims. It provided no tangible clues, a crime scene, and no evidence of a criminal. A crime scene with a brutal murder, and nothing was taken. Money was in the safes, guns in the house, electronics everywhere, and nothing was taken. It made no sense. And the husband, Mark Sievers, he was out of town in Connecticut. He could not have struck the blows. Why was Teresa Sievers dead? For 10 days, nothing that was pursued, no part of the investigation pointed anywhere. There was no direction to turn. Mark Sievers allowed law enforcement to download his cell phone, and at the time it appeared to provide no information that might lead to persons or a person responsible for the brutal murder of Teresa Sievers. a neighborhood canvass was conducted. A line search was done. And you heard Crime Scene Tech Rose talk about this. It covered all the way up Jarvis Street, across the connecting street, all the way down Allen Street. It went across the street into the dog park, looking for any kind of evidence, anything with blood, any type of weapon, and nothing was found. And then, July 9th, a phone call. A flight to Illinois, a trip two detectives did not expect to last long. But no stone could be unturned. Every possible lead, no matter how small, needed to be followed. And then a name, Curtis Wayne Wright. And a conversation that led to Jefferson County and a search warrant of Curtis Wayne Wright's residence. Curtis Wayne Wright's personal cell was taken into evidence, as was a garment that was found in his car outside his residence. And good detective legwork, checking all the names to see if any of those in the phone had any information that might assist the Lee County Sheriff's Office as they looked to try and figure out what happened. A happenstance conversation with Jimmy Ray Rodgers. He was not a suspect. He was just a name in a phone log. And they were just checking every name in a phone log to see if anyone could provide them any information. Jimmy Ray Rodgers stated he didn't know where Curtis Wayne Wright was the weekend of June 27th, and he himself, he had not been in Florida. While out in Missouri, the very quick, short trip became a long, extended trip. Detective Levitt learns that Curtis Wayne Wright rented a car from Enterprise, and he goes to the Enterprise location and discovers that Curtis Wayne Wright returned a rental car June 30th. A car rented on June 24th and returned on June 30th at 4:34 p.m. with 2,703 miles put on the car during that period of time. With the assistance of Enterprise, law enforcement is able to track the rental car to Arizona. And Crime Scene Tech Rose and Captain Long go out to Arizona to secure the car and to bring it back to the Lee County Sheriff's Office. And Detective Downs and Detective Levitt return to Missouri, and the investigation continues. With the rental car secured in the Lee County Evidence Bay, Crime Scene Technician Van Was tweezes out any hairs she can find in the car, and then with her forensic vacuum, vacuums the car that's been returned from Arizona, the rental car of Curtis Wayne Wright. She collected whatever trace evidence there was so that trace evidence could be sent to the FBI, because neither the Lee County Sheriff's Office nor the Florida Department of Law Enforcement had trace evidence examiners. And as no stone goes unturned, you heard they collected the hairs from the dogs and the cat of the Sievers, because perhaps, just perhaps, those hairs might be found in the rental car. Meanwhile, the work continues, and the Garmin is downloaded. And you heard from the analysts DeShazo and Lacombe on how they downloaded it and the information gleaned from it. And the report of some of that downloaded information is an exhibit that you can look through. And it showed locations in Southwest Florida for the weekend of Teresa Sievers' murder. In fact, a path from Missouri to Jarvis Road was found on the Garmin. And along that route, an email address, jimmyrayrogers90@gmail.com. Further, there were other stops they found. Stops that would indicate a stop at Walmart, at a couple of gas stations. And now, all of the videos collected around the whole area and up and down 75, perhaps now, they might be of some value. When the Walmart video is viewed, at the time that the Garmin indicates that the car was in that area, 2 men are seen walking in. Laura, might we dim the lights over the
Sure.
screen, please? And for the detectives who have been out in Missouri, who have seen Curtis Wainwright and Jimmy Ray Rodgers, the images are clear. When the video of the racetrack is viewed for the date and time reflected in the Garmin, a male is seen looking through a window at about June 29th, about 2:30 in the morning. And when the Shell Circle K videos are viewed for the date and time, June 29th around 2:50 in the morning, a white Hyundai is seen, and in the Shell store, video of the faces and the bodies of the 2 men. A break. For both men, Curtis Wainwright and Jimmy Rodgers have denied being in Florida. But not only is Curtis Wainwright's rented car in Florida, his face and his body are, as is Jimmy Ray Rodgers' face and body. Ultimately, a search warrant is obtained for Jimmy Ray Rodgers' residence, and the warrant is executed on August 25th. What law enforcement doesn't know as they approach the house to execute the search warrant is that immediately after the visit by Downs and Levitt back in July, that Jimmy Ray Rodgers isn't a suspect just checking the contacts in the phone visit, that Jimmy Ray Rodgers, as soon as they left, took the cell phone and the blue coveralls jumpsuit, got in the car with Taylor Showmaker, and would get rid of them. It would be 5 weeks before the search warrant of his residence. 5 weeks. Time for all evidence to be destroyed completely, to wash away in the creek, to wash with the water, to be cut by a lawnmower. Who would ever find a broken cell phone or blue coveralls on a back country road And if they did, who would ever think anything about it? Who would have any idea of their importance? As we know from the testimony and photos of items collected at Jimmy Ray Rodgers' residence, a red Budweiser t-shirt was collected, a wall hanging, white and black tennis shoes, a white wicking t-shirt, a white cooler, a black backpack. All were recovered from his residence. And in fact, if you look at State's Exhibit 35F, you see a photo of a cell phone on the bathroom sink. A photo of an Alcatel phone. The same brand as the phone that law enforcement would find the parts of on that backcountry road when they found the two broken phone parts and the blue coveralls. And the shoes and the white t-shirt that they recover from Jimmy Ray Rodgers' residence would be seen and can be seen on the Walmart video. But of all the evidence collected during the execution of the search warrant at Jimmy Ray Rodgers' residence, perhaps the most important were the statements of Taylor Showmaker, his girlfriend, for she would tell law enforcement about the throwing away of the blue coveralls. She would tell law enforcement of the breaking of the phone and the throwing away of the parts. She would take them to the very location on a backcountry road, not far from Doe Run, where Jimmy Ray Rodgers worked, where they would find those coveralls and the parts of the phone. It would be that recovered jumpsuit that would provide the fibers for comparison to the tweezed fibers and vacuum fibers in the rental car, and for the tape lifts from Teresa Sievers' dress and her left leg. It would be that jumpsuit that would give up a small fragment of hair, which the FBI, with the mitochondrial DNA analysis, would find the same sequencing as Jimmy Ray Rodgers. Perhaps those statements of Taylor Showmaker provide the first step towards the answer to the question on Teresa Sievers' lips as she was brutally attacked and bludgeoned to death. Why? A tower dump from near Jarvis Road, the scene of the murder, and a tower dump from the tower location near Curtis Wainwright's residence and Chapel Hill Court, a tower which can be seen in the photographs, would ultimately reveal a disconcerting pattern. Between May 17th and June 25th, at times when Curtis Wainwright's cell phone pinged off a tower, a burner number would ping minutes later. And between May 17th and June 25th, at times when Mark Sievers' personal cell pinged off a tower, a few minutes later, a burner number would ping. As Myra Simmons said, they would lay their head on the same pillow. And when AT&T phone records were obtained for the two burner phone numbers, it became clear that the phones were only used for a short period of time and for a limited number of calls, and almost all calls on either phone were to the other phone. And it didn't end there. The Cellbrite extractions from the personal cell phones of Curtis Wainwright and Mark Sievers revealed a series of what appear to be coded texts. It starts with, "Do not really want to use, quote, secure text, end quote, as I believe nothing is really secure once it is out there." A text from Mark Sievers to Curtis Wainwright. Then, mailing out today. Call me. It's simple. And then, since neither of us are likely to carry both with us, whenever you want to use the other one, just text me, quote, other, close quote, and I will call when can. All of these from Mark Sievers to Curtis Wainwright. And then as they look at the phone records, they see check other. And then hello brother from a, quote, other mother. And they will see messages like, "Do you think we can talk a little tonight? Just need 3 minutes. Setting static IP T home, quote, other, close quote, then changing. Call in 5 minutes. 5 more." And the text timed to the burner phone activation. Now, a burner phone is a prepaid phone number for which no name is associated. One can purchase a burner phone anonymously. Not all prepaid phones are used for nefarious reasons, but these phones provide an opportunity to avoid detection, and that certainly was the purpose with these phones. Why? Taylor Showmaker tells law enforcement that Jimmy Ray Rodgers spoke of getting $10,000 from the life insurance proceeds from the man whose wife was murdered. And the why is beginning to come into focus. The full extent of the conspiracy to kill Teresa Sievers is beginning to be revealed. For law enforcement had found a number of insurance policies in the Sievers residence, and they're in evidence. And so to see the picture of the events that unfolded that led to Teresa Sievers' death, we must go back in time. Perhaps back to April 29th, when Mark Sievers texts Curtis Wainwright and says, "Hopefully we can talk privately tomorrow. Nothing about you or Angie, but it's personal." And certainly back to April 30th, when Mark Sievers arrived in Missouri to stand at Curtis Wainwright's side as he married Angie Wright. For it's during the wedding festivities, both the night before and the day of, that Mark Sievers ultimately asked Curtis Wainwright to murder Teresa Sievers, or to have her killed. One can only wonder if that conversation might never have finalized this brutal crime, but for a box of hot dogs left back at a deli. Mark Sievers returns to Southwest Florida after the wedding, and a burner phone is purchased. A burner phone was purchased at a Walmart in Naples on Juliet Road. A Walmart used by the Sievers as receipts kept in Mark Sievers' office and taken into evidence when everything was being taken into evidence in the house reveal. And the burner phone would activate and ping off the same tower the day it was purchased as Mark Sievers' personal cell. And it would continue to only ping when Mark Sievers' personal cell was also pinging. And it would only ping in Southwest Florida. It was during this period that the murder of Teresa Sievers was discussed and it was planned. It was during this period that Curtis Wainwright would enlist the services of Jimmy Ray Rodgers. On May 5th, Mark Sievers purchased Delta airline tickets for the family to head up to Connecticut, with Teresa Sievers returning June 28th, late at night, and Mark Sievers and the children returning July 1st, Wednesday. The tickets are purchased on May 5th, and we know that a burner phone was purchased at the Walmart on Juliet Road on May 7th. On May 17th, Curtis Wainwright, after his conversation with Jimmy Ray Rodgers, purchases his burner phone. And on June 27th, the clock begins to tick on the final days of Teresa Sievers' life. Jimmy Ray Rodgers denied being in Florida, but his number came up on the radar. And the precision location data tracked Jimmy Ray Rodgers to Southwest Florida, to the Jarvis Street area during the period of the murder, and then showed him within 18 hours heading back to Missouri, down to the Jarvis Street. How eerie it is to see the precision location data for Teresa Sievers on June 28th, 2015, and the precision location data for Jimmy Ray Rodgers. And then the track back. How eerie to see. The photo from the racetrack north of here, near Bushnell. It shows a person in the window looking to get in. at a location that the Garmin would seem to indicate, as well as the precision location data, that Jimmy Ray Rodgers' phone is in the area. We lower the lights just a little bit, please. And then, at the Circle K Shell, at around 2:50 in the morning, on June 28th, to see these people walking through the door. And then finally, see Jimmy Ray Rodgers talking to the cashier in the store. Almost a hint of a smile on his face. Hardly a person upset by what has just happened. Rather, a person content with himself. A person who has completed his mission. A person now heading back home. Smile on her face. Why were Curtis Wainwright and Jimmy Ray Rodgers in Florida on June 28th and the early hours of June 29th? The answer to that question has become clear. They were here to murder Teresa Sievers. His Honor will instruct you on the law at the conclusion of closing arguments. And he'll provide you instructions on the charges, as well as deliberation, as well as considerations in weighing the evidence. But let us start with the law. The defendant is charged with 3 counts. First-degree murder, which can be proved one of 2 ways, either as premeditated murder or as felony murder. Conspiracy to commit murder, and burglary. He will also be instructing you on the legal definition of principal, because Mr. Rodgers has been charged as a principal. What is a principal? If a defendant helped another person or persons commit or attempt to commit a crime, the defendant is a principal and must be treated as if he had done all the things done by the other person. So a defendant that has a conscious intent that the act be done and says or does some act or says some word that incited, caused, encouraged, assisted, or advised the person who committed the actual crime is a principal. And in fact, that person doesn't even have to be present during the crime. So when Mr. Rodgers provided the gloves, the duct tape, the overalls, when he drove down with Curtis Wainwright, even if he had said, the state doesn't submit that he does, but even if he had said, I don't want to go in, I'm going to stay in the garage. As a principal, he must be treated as if he went inside and struck every single blow on Teresa Sievers. First-degree murder. As we said, it can be proven in one of two ways. It can be premeditated, or it can be felony. Let's talk about premeditated murder. There are three elements the state must prove. One is that Teresa Sievers is dead, and there is no question that Teresa Sievers is dead. That the death was caused by the criminal act of Jimmy Ray Rodgers, and that the killing was premeditated. Let's talk about these. Let's start with the death was caused by the criminal act of the defendant, of Jimmy Ray Rodgers. And let's talk about it in three categories: the witnesses, the physical evidence, and the logic. Witnesses. Curtis Wainwright testified to Jimmy Ray Rodgers' participation in the murder. Jimmy Ray Rodgers told Detective Levitt, when Detective Levitt went out to tell him he was there for the murder charge, he said, murder in St. Louis is 15 to 20 years, and I'm good with that. And Taylor Showmaker told us that Jimmy Ray Rodgers admitted to killing Teresa Sievers, and with a hammer. What's the physical evidence? Well, let's start with the fibers found on the dress and the left leg of Teresa Sievers, that, as we heard from the FBI analyst, exhibited the same microscopic and optical properties as the purple and purple-blue-white variegated fibers comprising item 32. Those were the overalls from the road that were found by the roadway. And accordingly, these fibers are consistent with originating from that jumpsuit on the road, or another item comprised of fibers that exhibit the same microscopic characteristics and optical properties. And then what did analyst Otto Statter tell us? You know, a fiber association is not a means of positive identification. However, due to the variability in manufacturing, dyeing, consumer use, and weathering of fibers within a textile, one would not expect to encounter a fiber at random that displays the same microscopic characteristics and optical properties as a particular source. evidence. The coveralls on the side of the road, they are the same color, brand. They have the same label as the sample coveralls from Doe Run. Coveralls recovered from the side of the road. They're labeled. Sample coveralls from Doe Run, the same label. As well as Mr. Conway's testimony that those on the side of the road are just like the coveralls that are used at Doe Run. And as we heard from the testimony, Doe Run is in a remote area on a 2-lane road in the windy part of the county. What else do we have for physical evidence? A hair fragment, no longer than a nickel, found on the coveralls. And that hair fragment was analyzed by the FBI. And the findings were that the mitochondrial DNA sequence obtained from the hair fragment and Jimmy Ray Rodgers' DNA sequence are the same within the sequence range obtained in common to the samples, and Jimmy Ray Rodgers cannot be excluded. In other words, everything in the sequence was compared and was the same. And a DNA inclusion was not found for Curtis Wainwright. What was analyst Ventress's math? 0.11% the mitochondrial DNA. Logic. Why drive 2,700 miles to spend 2 hours at a beach, relax at a rest stop, shop at Walmart, and go home? Why bring heavy overalls to Southwest Florida the end of June? Why break a cell phone into multiple pieces and scatter it in an area when you're ready for a new phone? State has proved element 2. And it has to be that it was premeditated. For premeditated murder, that would be the third element. So let's go through witnesses, physical evidence, and logic again. Now, premeditated, let's talk about premeditated for just a moment. Premeditated is killing after consciously deciding to do so. And the law doesn't fix an exact time that's needed for premeditation between the time the decision's made, the formation of the intent for the killing. But let's talk about that evidence. Let's talk about it as physical, as witnesses physical, and the logic of it. Well, Curtis Wainwright told us that it was planned. He told us that Jimmy Ray Rodgers agreed on May 17th, and Curtis Wainwright told us he told Mr. Rodgers it was a murder. Curtis Wainwright said they discussed the plans and firmed it up, that he sought Mr. Rodgers' feedback, that Mr. Rodgers brought the duct tape, Mr. Rodgers brought the coveralls, Mr. Rodgers brought the extra strength industrial gloves. And that before Teresa Sievers returned home, Mr. Rodgers picked up a hammer in the garage of the home of Teresa Sievers, and he joked about it being Teresa Sievers' destiny. And he made a swinging motion. Taylor Showmaker testified that Rodgers and Wright were friends. And, just a quick look at some of the pages of the extract that's been submitted into evidence from the download of Curtis Wainwright's personal cell shows numerous texts and phone calls between Curtis Wainwright and Jimmy Rodgers, that they hung out, barbecue, drinking, and stuff. She told us, and of course we know from the photo from the wedding, that she and Mr. Rodgers attended the wedding of Wayne and Angie Wright, and that Rodgers left with Wright and came back a few days later. And what did Jeffrey...
I'm going to object if we approach.
Okay.
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 And then Mr. Conway told us that Mr. Rodgers works at Doe Run, that Doe Run has toxic materials, and there were safety trainings about wearing protective clothing, that boxes of gloves were given to each worker, and that Mr. Rodgers told him he was going to Florida for his brother's graduation from law school. Now, what physical evidence do we have of premeditation? We have the blue coveralls brought to Southwest Florida at the very end of June. The heavy fabric, dark coveralls brought to Southwest Florida the very end of June. We have the industrial gloves brought to Southwest Florida the very end of June. And we have the video of that Circle K shell where you watch Mr. Rodgers walk up to the clerk and have a conversation and see the hint of a smile. This was a plan, and that is the face of someone content. What about the logic? Why drive more than 40 hours in a 2.5-day period? Why bring heavy coveralls to Southwest Florida, where it's hot and humid? Why bring industrial gloves to Southwest Florida? Certainly not for gardening. Why? If the plan is to go to the beach, not bring towels and beach shoes. Why? Deceive your boss that you are going to Southwest Florida for your brother's graduation. The state has proved the premeditation. Felony murder. 3 elements. Teresa Sievers is dead, and while engaged in the commission of a felony, Teresa Sievers died. Does not have to be at the hands of Jimmy Ray Rodgers. Or, while attempting to commit a felony, Teresa Sievers died. And again, it doesn't have to be at the hands of Jimmy Ray Rodgers. Ladies and gentlemen, the state submits this was a premeditated murder. Conspiracy. Conspiracy is that the intent of the defendant was that a murder would be committed, and in order to carry out the intent, the defendant agreed, conspired, combined, or confederated with Mark Sievers and Curtis Wainwright to cause the death of Teresa Sievers. It is not necessary that Jimmy Ray Rodgers did any act in furtherance of the offense that was conspired. Conspiracy is separate. It is the getting together and conspiring to do it, not the finished act. But what is the evidence of conspiracy? It is multifaceted, and it includes much of what we talked about when we talked about premeditation. And it can be difficult to understand because in a conspiracy, every co-conspirator doesn't have to talk to every other co-conspirator. So, in the center of this conspiracy, we'll place Mr. Wright. And to our right, we'll place Mr. Sievers. Mr. Sievers conspired, asked Mr. Wright, and then conspired with Mr. Wright to have his wife killed. And Mr. Wright, in speaking with Mr. Sievers, agreed. Then Mr. Wright asked Jimmy Ray Rodgers to participate in this. And Jimmy Ray Rodgers agreed. And we know that through physical evidence, not just from the words and statements we've heard from the stand, but by the physical evidence. And what was this conspiracy? It was to murder Teresa Sievers. That is conspiracy. What witness testimony and physical evidence do we have that shows this conspiracy? And remember, conspirators don't each have to talk to each other, but there has to be a common design between and among them. We know that Jimmy Ray Rodgers agreed to commit this crime on May 17th, and that Curtis Wainwright told him it was a murder. That they discussed the plans and firmed it up, and Curtis Wainwright says he sought his feedback. But we also know and heard about the duct tape being brought, the industrial strength gloves that were brought, and we know about the blue coveralls that were brought. And finally, the cell phone and GPS records that track them down here. Once having entered into a conspiracy, the only defense to it would be to persuade the other conspirators not to commit the offense. That didn't happen. Or to stop them or him from committing the offense. That didn't happen. Or to completely renunciate one's participation before the offense occurred. Jimmy Ray Rodgers drove down with Curtis Wainwright. He brought the blue jumpsuits. He brought the industrial gloves. He was a full participant in what happened. Burglary. The third charge. Burglary has just a couple of elements. Jimmy Ray Rodgers entered a structure owned or in the possession of Teresa Sievers, and at the time he entered, he had the intent to commit a crime. That is what the evidence that has been produced in this court makes absolutely clear. And in fact, you can infer the defendant had the intent to commit a crime if entry was done stealthily and without the consent of the occupant. And clearly, Teresa Sievers did not give Jimmy Ray Rodgers permission to enter into her home. During the course of this trial, there has been much evidence introduced. And much of it you will be able to take back into the jury room with you. I just want to talk about a little bit of the evidence. There have been so many photos that you can look at. There have been swabs of DNA collected. There was a hammer that was taken into evidence, as well as the hair. Receipts gathered. In evidence is pages from the download of Mark Sievers' phone, as well as pages from the download of Curtis Wainwright's phone, the Garmin that provided the track down, the precision location records from AT&T that provided so much information, the enterprise documents that let law enforcement track down the car. And let's make no mistake about the importance of that car, because while we have talked about the fibers that were found on the dress and on the leg of Teresa Sievers, those fibers were also found in that rental car. Google records, which make it clear Jimmy Ray Rodgers 90 at gmail.com is that email address. The white cooler, which you can look at. The black backpack, the shoes. The jumpsuit on the side of the road was introduced into evidence, as were the sample jumpsuits. The broken cell phone was introduced into evidence. It states Exhibit 38A and B. As I said, there were photos, including that of Curtis Wainwright's residence, including that of Jimmy Ray Rodgers' residence, including that of Mark Sievers' condo. There's a wealth of documents you can look at, and you can look at all the charts that were introduced in evidence that show the cell phones and the Garmin and the connection between the phones. Excuse me. The track phone records that show the purchase of the 858 burner phone at a Walmart in Naples, and the activation of it that turns out to activate in the same location as Mark Sievers' cell phone pinged. The Delta records, the fiber analysis, the mitochondrial DNA, and the list goes on and on. The court will instruct you that there are factors that you can consider as you weigh the evidence and decide and determine what weight or credibility to give the evidence, because it is to you as the jurors alone to determine what weight to give each piece of evidence that's introduced. Did the witness seem to have an opportunity to see and know the things about which they testified? Now, ladies and gentlemen, much has been made about Curtis Wainwright's testimony. People who commit crimes don't try to do them where there are witnesses. Sometimes the best evidence is the evidence from someone who was there. Was the witness honest and straightforward in answering questions? Did the witness's testimony agree with the testimony of other witnesses? Has the witness been offered or received any money to get the witness to testify? Any pressure or threat for a witness that affected the truth of that witness's testimony? Inconsistent statements? Has the witness been convicted of a felony? But it will be your life experiences, your common sense, that will assist you in determining how to assess the credibility of each witness and each piece of evidence. It will be what guides you as you evaluate the testimony. You have seen the witnesses on the stand. You evaluate their demeanor. Taylor Showmaker, the young woman who came into court, who told police what her boyfriend did in terms of getting rid of the blue jumpsuit and the broken cell phone, and which they were able to find, and who told the police what he said. Yes, yeah, I think is what he said. He had murdered Teresa Sievers and done it with a hammer. She wasn't intimidated or threatened by law enforcement. There's a difference between worry and intimidation and threats. You know, clearly she did not feel intimidated by Detective Downs, because months later, almost 5 months later, when she finds herself in tough straits, who does she call? Detective Downs. That's who she calls to see if there's any help. But she didn't make her statements with the promise of being paid for them, and she told you in this courtroom she wasn't here because she was being paid for her testimony. A young woman, you judge her credibility. You saw her on the stand. Curtis Wainwright received a great benefit from finally admitting his involvement and agreeing to testify for the state. Without him, 2 of the co-conspirators might never be held responsible for this brutal murder. You saw Curtis Wainwright on the stand. He is not a mastermind. Some of the most profound words that came out of him might be that 1, he's not very good at this, and 2, he made horrible decisions. But it was a plan hatched by a husband who wanted to get rid of his wife. Called up a friend playing for sympathy, a friend in need of money. And Jimmy Ray Rodgers, why was he willing to kill Teresa Sievers? There are 10,000 reasons why he was willing to kill Teresa Sievers. Common sense, ladies and gentlemen. This was almost a perfect plan, executed by 2 less than skilled people, coming from Missouri, coming from out of state before the sun's up, returning in the dark of night. Dressed and clothed to avoid leaving any DNA, as jurors, you must leave so much behind when you come and sit on a trial. You must leave so much behind, your cell phones, your iPads, all of your equipment, when you go into a jury room to deliberate. But what you don't leave behind, and please don't leave it behind, is your common sense. The state has proven that Jimmy Ray Rodgers is guilty of first-degree premeditated murder. Find him guilty. The state has proven that Jimmy Ray Rodgers is guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Find him guilty. The state has proved that Jimmy Ray Rodgers is guilty of burglary. Find him guilty. Thank you.
Defense.
Excuse me, Coach.
Okay.
Before moving to the defense's closing statements, we're going to let everyone stretch their legs, use the restroom. Still at this point, do not talk about the case among yourselves or with anybody else, or look up any people or places involved, and we'll be with you momentarily. Please be seated. We'll be in recess.